It just is so easy to call it CEJA, right? What is your high-level assessment of this bill? And then we'll get into some of the nitty-gritties.
So the highest of high-level analysis is that this is an omnibus bill, right? It's not just a renewable bill. The bill is focused on equity and job training, and that lays over into the renewable sector because a lot of this job training is oriented towards developing a workforce that can work in the renewable energy sector.
Today on the Clean Power Hour, it's a new day in Illinois. We have new energy legislation in the fall of 2021. We got the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act signed and passed in September of 2021. This triples the amount of resources coming into the solar, wind, and battery storage industries in Illinois. We're gunning for 40% clean grid by 2035? My guest today is Mark Pruitt. He is the principal of the Power Bureau, and he was the original director of the Illinois Power Agency. Welcome to the Clean Power Hour, Mark.
Hey, good morning. Thanks, Tim. Appreciate the invitation.
It's great to see you, and I love touching base with you because you have such a depth and breadth of experience with clean energy in Illinois. And for anybody who's been working in Illinois, it was an amazing run that we had right from 2018 to 2020, and then it was crocodile tears because the funding for renewable energy credits ran out. And everybody was waiting with bated breath for phase two, so to speak, of the program. We needed additional funding, meaning dollars paid by consumers on their power bill that goes into the coffers of the utilities that then pay that out to solar and wind system owners. That's how our game works here in Illinois. And this is not an uncommon scenario, that we have a REC-driven renewable energy market, which is underpinned by a RPS, a renewable portfolio standard. I believe the new RPS is 40% by 2030 and 50% by 2040. And then the backdrop to that is that we already have 40% carbon free with a nuclear grid. So we're going to dive into this today and tease out some of the nuances. Much of the rulemaking has not been done yet, so we can't answer all of the questions. But if you have questions, please reach out to me. You can reach me on Twitter, TG Montague on Twitter. You can find me at cleanpowerhour.com, where all of this content lives. Please give us a like, a share, and a thumbs up. And let me know who you want to bring on the show, right? Because I'm just one guy. I'm very curious. I'm very interested. I am a solar professional, and I live, breathe, sleep, and eat solar energy. But I need my audience to help me find the path to the best guests. So please reach out to me. So Mark, give us your high-level assessment of what CEJA, as we can call this, and I apologize for that acronym because there was another CEJA in the run-up to getting the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, but it just is so easy to call it CEJA, right? And Climate and Equitable Jobs Act is a very important title, but it is a mouthful. So what is your high-level assessment of this bill? And then we'll get into some of the nitty-gritties.
Right. So the bill was rather lengthy, and I always try to remind clients, students, and just people at cocktail parties, this was several hundred pages of detail. So it wasn't just kind of passed off as a, hey, let's do something for energy. There was a lot of work from a lot of stakeholders that went into this. So when you think about CEJA at a high level, you need to think about the fact that it actually captures and encapsulates portions of, I think the count was 6 separate predecessor bills. There was the original CEJA, the Clean Energy Jobs Act. There was the Path to 100 bill. There was the the coal to solar bill. There was a bill that focused exclusively on solar in schools. There was another bill that dealt with utility rate making, and then another bill that dealt with nuclear power plant rate stability. So the highest of high level analysis is that this is an omnibus bill. right? It's not just a renewable bill. So when people in the renewable industry focus on this, they need to understand that, there's their portion that speaks directly to the renewable sector. But I think it's also very helpful to understand those other components because in some instances, those components work together. A good example is there's quite a bit of the bill is focused on equity and job training, and that um, lays over into the renewable sector because a lot of this job training is oriented towards developing a workforce that can work in the renewable energy sector. So, it's helpful to look at the incentives for the RECs and the contract terms and the carve outs and where all these things are going to go. And I think that that's very important for the industry and largely good news. But I think that they also need to pay attention to the other portions of the bill to understand where there are overlays. So
Well,
with that
let's
said,
talk a little more
yeah,
about training and jobs
mhm,
and the equitable aspects because this is a very hot topic. And here we
yeah,
are in the fall of 2021. The economy is cooking. There's very low unemployment, and consumers are struggling to be excited, though, about the economy. And I like to say that if you're a young person casting about for a career, look at clean energy because no matter what you do, you could be a salesperson, a marketing person, a finance person, an engineer, a tradesperson. You could be a laborer. You could be anything under the sun, and you're going to find a path to success in clean energy. It is that kind of a 30-year run, which is very
mhm,
unique. There are few industries that are going to have just 30 years of pure growth. And yes, you may not be able to maintain a job in a certain county, in a certain state for 10 years. You may have to move where the jobs go in the renewable
mhm.
space. But trust me, you will have a job in the renewables industry if you are serious about getting in. And so please pay attention here because this is a great opportunity because there's dollars flowing from consumers and government now into training programs to help build this workforce, right? And especially targeting low and middle income populations who are somewhat disadvantaged and don't necessarily have easy access to the economy that you and I do, Mark.
Well, exactly right. And I think that was really a foundational premise of the original CEJA, the Clean Energy Jobs Act, really focused on equity issues and then clean transition or just transition issues. And just transition, just as a quick side note, that is providing assistance to communities that are losing traditional energy resources. Um, so communities with coal mines, communities with coal, natural gas, oil, and nuclear power plants. So, it was very, very broad view of okay, who is going to be disrupted through this transition. But getting back to the jobs element, you're absolutely right. The energy sector in general needs all kinds of disciplines, not only from the application side, but also on the business support side. So bookkeeping, accounting, lawyers, marketing, all those functions as well. I think that for Illinois, one of the drivers for the final version of CEJA and the job training and equity and the direction and focus of some of the incentives programs for projects within economic justice communities or environmental justice communities is really driven by what occurred under FEJA, which was passed back in 2016. FEJA was passed with a lot of fanfare, and the thought was, well, this is going to be great for jobs. And I think that through that experience of seeing the rapid run up of companies coming to Illinois, establishing business operations in Illinois, building and putting iron in the ground, there was an understanding that maybe that rising tide wasn't lifting all boats, that maybe some of that development was bypassing certain communities in favor for other communities, maybe based on economics, maybe other reasons. But the idea, I think, this time around was well, let's make a considered effort to really be precise and very clear that we want BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities participating in this transition. And that's where you've got a number of training programs that are going to be spread throughout the state. There's going to be assistance for new companies, small contracting companies, for instance, coming in to the renewable sector that are going to have business training, marketing, kind of stand-up operations, even special funding to assist them with their startups. There are hiring requirements for all companies that are going to be working on projects of a certain size and larger in the wind and solar sector to make hires from graduates from these programs as well as from the BIPOC community. And there's going to be reporting. So it's not just well, we have a goal and people make a good faith effort. Well, no, there's actually going to be quite a bit of documentation that goes into this. And I think that the industry is going to have to be very proactive in making the case that they have made every not only good faith effort, but every concerted effort to ensure that all the opportunities that are made available through CHA are made that they're open to all populations in the state.
I'm especially excited about the incentives for entrepreneurs, people who want to own their own rooftop solar company, for example, or a commercial industrial solar company. There are incentives in CEJA to help those entrepreneurs get off the ground and prop up a real contracting company. We are going to need a lot more contractors in the state of Illinois if we're going to fulfill the goals of the bill. And of course, contractors need workers. They need workers in the office. They need workers in the field. They need training, et cetera. They need materials. There's, this is a whole economy. And then there's the traditional stuff that we are already familiar with. This helps the unions accelerate their training programs. It helps organizations like Grid Alternatives, which is a clean energy organization that is dedicated to bringing clean energy to disadvantaged communities and populations. And so it is an accelerant on what already exists, but it is also fertilizer for more, better, different approaches to growing the clean energy economy, right? In theory.
I agree. And there's words on paper, and that's nice. And people watching your podcast might be like, well, these are two old white guys. Well, one old white guy. It's the years, not the miles.
Oh, yeah, I qualify.
Talking about this, but there's a certain kind of real practical aspect as to why we need more small contractors, especially the point you were making. And that's because there are physical constraints on the transmission system. And I think the utilities that were involved in the stakeholder discussions that led up to this bill were very clear that you can't build your way towards these RPS goals exclusively with utility scale wind and solar. There's not enough transmission capacity in the state to absorb that kind of utility scale generation. That's a fact. And it's also a fact that building transmission takes years, if not decades, to complete. So if you're going to make progress towards the goal, you have to be able to install the renewables in those areas where there is capacity, system capacity, to absorb the ebbs and flows of generation. And that's at the distribution level. And getting to that distribution level for, not to speak in code to the audience, but distribution level is a local utility, right? Not the big power lines along the highway, that's transmission, but the lines that run down the alley in your neighborhood, that's distribution. So being able to get solar panels deployed in smaller locations, at the local mini mart, at your church, your school, your home, that is where we're going to have to deploy these resources just from a timeliness standpoint. There's not a considered approach that allows you to build out on the utility scale. You have to have that distributed scale to be able to make the goal, and I think to really develop and deliver savings and cost benefits to consumers. So when they see solar panels going up and they talk to their neighbor who's made that commitment, they understand that, yeah, this is a little complex, but my neighbor was able to make it work. I can make this work. So having contractors who are close to those communities, they're going to be the trusted entity that's going to be able to make that case to their friends and neighbors. And I think that that's another great reason for the equity play that's in the bill.
Yeah. So I like to say it's a both and. We need DG,
Mm-hmm.
we need rooftop solar on residents, on small commercial buildings, and large commercial industrial facilities, on campuses, on cornfields. We need community
Right.
solar. There's significant incentives to grow the community solar program. And then I don't know how much incentives there are for utility solar, but utility solar is coming like it or not. There are just gobs and gobs, gigawatts and gigawatts, right, of utility scale projects in the pipeline, both in MISO and PJM, which are the two ISOs that cover Illinois. Well, those are the two, right? And then there's the co-ops and munis. They aren't necessarily the first to dive in Illinois yet, but the fact that Prairie State is going to get sunsetted, which was a major stumbling block. But now this bill puts coal and natural gas in the bullseye, and they are going to. The goal is to sunset all coal and natural gas in the state of Illinois by 2045. That is only 24 years away. And for you and I, Mark, 10 years goes by fairly fast. And so
Right.
it does seem like a long time to somebody who's 20 years old. I get that. But for me, I'm 55, 20 years is, like, okay, we need to be serious about making this happen if we're going to make it happen. And then
Right.
in parallel, you have what the utilities like Vistra are doing. And you mentioned the coal to solar legislation that Vistra had written. Now that got sandwiched into the Omnibus bill, and they have specific incentives to close down a fleet of coal plants and put solar farms and battery farms right there around those facilities, which makes perfect sense because there's great infrastructure and presumably there's capacity on the grid because there was a power plant. Some of those power plants are already getting closed, and
Right.
and literally, like, some of them are already closed, the power plants on that
Right.
list. And so those workers are casting about for something else to do, and now they have a lifeline to this newer, faster growing industry, which is solar and batteries and wind power. And that is it. It's such a win-win. That's why I'm so enthusiastic about renewable energy. It is good for people. It's good for jobs. It's good for the environment, and it's good for the economy. And so, but it's not without its challenges, right? The logistical challenges of deploying gigawatts and gigawatts of clean energy are non-trivial, and making it work and working through the process with the utilities. That's a major frustration for solar developers, of course, right? I know developers who won't touch MISO with a 10-foot pole, for example, because the interconnection process is so lengthy. It just takes gobs and gobs and gobs of time, and probably money as well. And then there's the question of, can you get your facility interconnected in a cost-effective manner? And many projects will die on the vine. And so it's deep water. These developers need to know what they're doing. And then at the DG level, it's not as treacherous waters per se, but it's got its own challenges and risks and rewards. And I know installers. I work for an installer myself, so I work in the commercial, industrial, and utility space. But I know installers who won't touch residential with a 10-foot pole, for example.
Right.
And vice versa. I know residential installers who are very timid about commercial, industrial. And that's fine. Like, everybody has their risk profile and their ambitions and their passion, and we need all of this. So
Right.
I'm curious though, on the coal to solar piece,
Mhm.
what are your thoughts about that? How well is that going to work, so to speak?
Well, I think that coal to solar is probably going to deploy fairly rapidly, as you noted, or maybe I'll back up. So you'd mentioned Vistra, NRG also falls in this space. These are companies that have owned large coal generating plants, primarily in southern Illinois, but also a few plants in northern Illinois. And the companies have already announced that they're closing a fair number of these plants. I believe it's 6 in downstate. I think it's 3 in upstate Illinois, and that they were simply going to close down for economic reasons, right? That were not driven by this bill at all. The coal to solar concept came about as a mechanism to accomplish a few things. One was to allow for that infrastructure, those big substations, all the big wires that go into the power plant. They're already paid for. They can continue to operate, but they're not going to be taking in electricity from the coal operation anymore. That's getting closed down. There was also another primary concern, which was what happens to the tax base of these towns and counties where these power plants are located. In some cases, I've read press accounts where the local power plant is either the number one or number two tax payer in the county, and that if that asset went from fully operational industrial site tax rate to basically abandoned, that the school districts, the road district, the county government, local government would see a significant reduction in revenues to provide services to the residents. So the idea was coal to solar was a way to allow those power plants to maintain their operations status, not generating as much electricity or electricity in the same manner, but by installing solar and batteries at these sites, they're utilizing that infrastructure. They maintain their active status. They can continue to make those payments into the community coffers and maintain some stability in those communities. So my understanding is that the companies that are affected by this are now going to be able to count on long-term REC sales and purchases of those RECs that are going to allow for the financing of deployment of a good amount of solar and battery storage at those sites. I think they're probably going to move fairly quickly because these are well-capitalized organizations. They have the interconnection already there. They own the land or have been in the process of taking up options for adjacent properties. So I think it's going to work fairly quickly. There's always going to be, need for improvement, but it's an interesting aspect of how the parties came together for this bill and how some solutions were able to kind of break their way through and become part of the final package.
Yeah. So when we're talking about coal to solar, it is a very specific segment of the legislation that addresses specific power plants. Prairie State is one of the newer power plants. I think it was propped up in 2012, I want to say. Is that right?
I believe that's when it became fully operational. It was under development.
Yeah.
I believe the original agreements to build that plant probably date back to 2005, 2006.
Yeah. But and that was a stumbling block, right? Because there's a whole host of munis and maybe co-ops, I don't know, but munis for sure, right, that are contracted with that, and then that plant has contracts in other states. It's a very big power plant. It's near Carbondale, Illinois, and there is a big solar farm that's being built, not quite in the shadow, but it's probably operational actually. It's been over a year since I visited, and it was under construction. I think it was developed by Ranger Power, I want to say. but it was on the order of 100 megawatts, something like that.
Right.
And at that time, that was a big solar farm in Illinois. We now have seen announcements of 600 megawatt solar farms in Illinois that are getting permitted. So now whether they'll get their interconnection agreement is another matter, but
Right.
it is happening. Very large scale solar is happening. And then over in Indiana, we've seen Mammoth Solar all in the news that Doral is developing. That's a 1.3 gigawatt facility that's going to be built in 4 phases. Phase 1 is under construction now, and that is a 13,000 acre solar farm. So talk about big solar. Here in the Midwest, it is coming.
Yep.
And the utilities are driving a lot of that large scale stuff, right? But when it comes to closing down facilities like Prairie State, how does that work? Do you have any sense?
Well, the Prairie State Power Plant, as you indicated, is a large coal fueled power plant. It's probably one of the newer power plants and coal power plants in North America. It's about 1,200 megawatts, so it's a great big plant. It's a mine mouth operation, meaning that the coal that supports that plant's operation is actually located across the street from the power plant, and the coal is mined from the mine, put on a conveyor belt, and conveyed over to the plant. Ash from that combustion process is then conveyor belted back into the mine, and it's redressed over into that mine operation. So it's a very integrated operation with both miners and coal plant operators. Also, as you indicated, that there is ownership as well as offtake agreements with co-ops and municipalities, municipal electrics, I believe, spreading over as many as 8 states. I might be wrong on that, but it's in the dozens of offtake agreements. Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, Kentucky, Iowa, Ohio, West Virginia, and the like. So I think that, and the hang up that plant posed in relation to CEJA was that some of the parties took a really firm line and said we need to have a firm end date for the operation of coal and gas plants in Illinois. And that's okay. That's a fair policy objective. The issue is that it's fairly complicated. It's not up to a state to determine which power plants operate or not. That's the operation of a power plant technically comes under the purview of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and is also under the direct operational supervision of PJM and Mid-Continent ISO. In the case of Prairie State, Mid-Continent ISO is the ISO that regulates power plant operations. State can regulate emissions through its Environmental Protection Agency, but when it comes to the operation of power plants, the federal guideline is that power plants must operate if the operation of that plant is necessary to ensure reliability. So reliability is the highest priority for the operation of the grid, not cost, not emissions. It's fine to put policy objectives forward to change that, but in the here and now, reliability is the driver. So I think that what occurred through the process with CEJA was something of a middle ground. Yes, there are firm end dates for or goal dates set for when natural gas and coal plants must get down to zero emissions for greenhouse gases, provided that the ISO or RTO agrees that those power plants can cease operations if that's what's necessary to get to zero emissions, and reliability can be maintained. So the idea is, yes, Prairie State has a 2045 end date. Ownership probably wasn't really happy with that because they have debt that extends out beyond 2045, so that's a problem. But be that as it may, if 2045 end date for zero emissions goal is not met by 2045, that doesn't necessarily automatically shut down that plant. That plant can only move towards a shutdown with the authorization of Mid-Continent ISO. So there's something of a safety valve there that these plants can and will get to zero emissions, but not in a manner that's going to reduce reliability for the consumers that depend on that power to be consistent and high quality in central southern Illinois.
So is it conceivable, though, that that plant would be retrofitted with carbon capture and storage technology and keep burning coal past 2045?
My understanding is that the ownership of that plant has received a grant or has applied for a grant with U.S. Department of Energy that would fund a study for carbon capture and sequestration from that plant. Sequestration is allowed as a mechanism to get to that zero emissions goal. So I imagine that over the span of years between now and 2045, ownership is probably going to be looking at a range of options that can get them into a compliance pattern. Um,
I'm having
you know,
flashbacks of Future Gen, Mark. Remember
I was
Future
there for
Gen?
Future Gen too. Yeah. Oh yeah, I remember. Yeah. The agency was responsible for purchase the energy from that power plant. That never came about because it just their funding structure just really didn't comply to how the market worked here in Illinois. But
Mm,
there's 20 years is, like you said, can go by quickly, but 20 years can also bring about a lot of technological advances. If we just look back to 2001, going back 20 years, you and I can remember 2001. The state of Illinois was not deregulated or fully deregulated at that time. The power plants owned by the utilities had just been sold to independent power producers. There was no renewable industry to speak of in Illinois. There was no talk of batteries. A
yeah,
lot has changed. So I
exactly.
believe that people can figure out solutions. I think, though, that for the purposes of CEJA, it was important for some of the stakeholders to be able to point and say, look, we have an end date. This is a climate bill, not an energy bill. I heard that stated a number of times, and we can't have a climate bill unless we have a shutdown of coal and gas assets. But to be clear, um, those shutdown schedules only apply to generating assets with nameplate capacities of less than 25 megawatts. So that still leaves open the possibility for the continued operation of cogeneration facilities, small peaker plants, and the like. So we'll have to see how the market responds to that. Big central power plants probably not going to be Illinois is probably not a great place for them to operate. But if it's a gas plant and they feel that they can get to a hydrogen supply that would allow them to utilize hydrogen as opposed to natural gas, well, maybe that's a solution that can comply with the new state standard.
I know that we have a cadre of solar developers listening to this, and they are chomping at the bit for what does CEJA mean for me? And in particular, I want to address three market spaces. I want to address large C&I. This is, and the way this played out under FEJA was fleets of Walmarts and Target stores being solarized, schools and campuses being solarized, factories being solarized. Anybody who wanted to could go for it, so to speak. But solar developers are a key part of the economy because they have been doing this in other markets and they know the playbook and they know how to get the ear of the Walmarts and Targets, these global, Fortune 500 or Fortune 100 companies. And so what does CEJA, the Equitable Jobs Act, mean for large C&I, community solar, and then maybe we can riff a little more on small utility or medium utility and large utility. But large C&I and community solar, how does this play out for those developers?
Right. So
And
I think there's
installers, for that
some
matter.
right. And I view the installers and the developers as being joined at the hip here because if the developers can get the deal, then that's going to work for the installers. If there's a complication for the developers, then that flows downstream to become a complication for the installers from a scheduling and pipeline and supply and labor and everything else. So a few of the top line items that I would be watching or I would be considering as a developer, and I'd also have an interest as an installer, is now large CNI and community solar can have projects up to 5 megawatts. The past limit was 2 megawatts. The new limit is now 5 megawatts. So you can have a material uptick in the size of projects that you can consider for development and implementation.
And
That's
that's
probably the
AC,
first.
right?
Correct.
That's an important distinction here. So 5
Yep.
megawatts AC is at least 6 and maybe 7 DC.
Right. Right. And it's all sized to the nameplate of that inverter. So yeah, AC is where it goes, and that's material. It might allow for you know there may have been C&I customers with projects that 2 megawatts wasn't enough. They needed more. Well, now you can accommodate that. It's also a situation, and I've already spoken to a few clients who already installed the 2 megawatts, and they've got room for more. So they want to go and take a second bite at the apple. These are large energy intensive industries. I think it's also, when you're talking about the Fortune 100 corporations, especially those in energy intensive industries, well, now maybe you're actually moving the needle, right? 2 megawatts might have been a science fair project for them in the context of their energy operation, but maybe 5 megawatts now starts to look to be material, right? So I think that is probably the top line issue. Some of the other issues relative to CEJA that I think the developers and installers need to be mindful of is the prevailing wage requirements that now apply across the board. And I don't think that there's a lot of argument that that is going to be well policed and enforced in the state. So just for those that haven't operated under those requirements in the past, it's just something you're going to have to get used to. I think that the larger size might lead to some complications for interconnection. That's going to be highly locationally dependent. So I think that is probably something that's going to take a little bit more time and consideration, because now you're bumping up into what are legitimate constraints. I trust from the utility. So those are some physical issues and as well as financial. One other sleeper issue, and this might be too deep in the weeds, so feel free to edit this out, but part of the way projects are financed from the consumer point of view is, look, I trust my developer to optimize the federal incentives, the state incentives, the utility incentives, and then I'm going to have a power purchase agreement to purchase everything that comes off that system. Great. I think everybody understands that. However, if that system is going to export electricity on a monthly basis from a net metering perspective, they need to be very mindful going forward that now there's another party at the table that has an interest here, and that's the retail energy supplier. So if I'm a large C&I customer, I install solar, that system is supersized, meaning it's exporting electricity to the grid. The value of that excess electricity from a net metering perspective has to be determined by my retail energy supplier. That retail energy supplier, under the statute, is now obligated to provide a fair market value for net metering credits. They need to be compensated for that excess electricity. And that value must include not just energy, which is what was under FEJA, but now also capacity and transmission. The issue here is that the retail energy supplier only sees kind of a benefit for that excess electricity on the energy side. They aren't compensated themselves for any capacity or transmission credits that they are now obligated to give to the customer. So if you've got a large C&I and they're exporting a lot of electricity, under the statute, they're due to get a lot of credit back from their retail energy supplier. I don't think all retail energy suppliers are quite understanding their obligations now. And once they do understand that they're going to have to pay something for which they're not receiving compensation, they're probably going to trigger a clause within their supply contract that allows them to reset prices. And it's just going to be a little bumpy working through that. So I would just encourage developers, especially, that when you're looking at these systems going forward, just to be very mindful and to take that extra step, reach out to the retail supplier and get a written documentation about how they're going to value the net metering credit. Because if you install with an understanding that turns out to not be the case, that can really throw off your economics. What you don't want is having a PPA where the customer is paying 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour for all the kilowatt hours coming off of that rooftop system and receiving compensation that's less than that 4.5% or 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour
Right.
from the
Right.
retail energy supplier, or
Yep.
having the retail energy supplier saying, we're going to raise your rate from 4 cents to 6 cents a kilowatt hour to make up for what we have to credit you back. It will just get ugly for everybody. So, this is a sleeper issue. And again, if it's too deep in the weeds, that's fine. But this is something that's really going to have to be addressed by the retail energy supply community. And I think it's the developers that need to start carrying that message forward to those retailers.
Yeah. So you have to, if you're a C&I customer, let's say you're a facility owner, you have to make sure you're working with a credible installer or developer who
Yeah.
really understands the nuances. And so be warned. Now, let's talk about community solar. Community solar is rec driven in Illinois. You build a central power plant. These historically were 20-acre solar farms. Now they're going to be 40 to 50-acre solar farms. Like we have now at the University of Illinois, they just built a 50-acre solar farm, Solar Farm 2, here in Champaign-Urbana. And then you can sign up off-takers, as few as 4 historically, I think, and as many as hundreds. And then there'll be carve-outs for low, medium income segments also. We should probably touch on Solar for All. That's its own parallel universe, as I like to call it, which is also being tripled, I think. But what can the community solar developers look forward to? I mean, what's famous in Illinois is that we have this queue of 700 "quote unquote" shovel-ready projects. They're not necessarily truly shovel-ready, but they have a special use permit. They have site control. They have an interconnection agreement. And so some of the heavy lifting has certainly been done. And now they're going to start winning awards in Block 5, which will start in December, I believe. But in mid-December, the IPA is "quote unquote" ordered now to do this, right?
Right.
And so then there will be a tranche of these additional 2 megawatt AC projects, 3 megawatt DC. And then there'll be another wave now of greenfield development of larger community solar projects, because it's just, if you're going to develop a ground mount solar farm, bigger gives you economies of scale. And so you're incentivized to do that if you can. I mean, there will be a spectrum. You could do a 500 kW community solar farm, or you could do now a 6 or 7 megawatt DC solar farm, and it'll be a spectrum. But there'll be a lot of these larger, because 40 acres in Illinois is not a lot of real estate. And if you're a layperson listening to this going, "Hey, Tim, what are you guys crazy? You're going to pave over the breadbasket of America." Think again, because this is a fraction of our landscape. I live in a county, prime farm ground, 640,000 acres. We are swimming in real estate. We only need 1% of the landscape to completely solarize our economy. So you can stop freaking out about that. And it's good for the land. The land is going to be organic farm ground if it's planted in native plants and the owner developer does proper maintenance. This is truly good for the land. And so it is a win-win, and it's great for rural communities because it provides a tax base for rural communities, which are really hurting in all across the Midwest. But what have I not spoken to, Mark? What is going to happen with community solar? Is it just more better, slightly different, or is there some radical change here?
I think that there's some, again, these might be sleeper issues, but along with the size of the projects, I think that the change in the rec contracts, the payout term, is going to be material for developers. It used to be that community solar project would receive a 15-year contract to sell their recs, and then be compensated for that 15 years of RECs in the first 4 years of operation. Now that's going to change for the new projects. They're going to be getting a 20-year contract and paid out over 20 years. So I think that that's a material change. And I think that there's some developers who say, nuts, I like that front-loaded model. I've also heard some developers say, well, yeah, that loses us that front end, but we are now assured revenue for a longer term. So we're not having to convince our financial backers of some type of upgrade in our tail revenues, right? We can show revenue over a longer period of time. So there's some that feel that this stretching out the payment period is actually going to be helpful for finance. So I think that is a material difference. The other items I would be focusing on is that now new community solar must have 50% small subscribers, and as opposed to this kind of graduated set of incentives, growing incentives to get up to 75% for those small subscribers, which are residential and small commercial customers. And ComEd small commercial is a non-residential account that has a peak demand of between 0 and 100 kW in the past year. In Ameren, it's between 0 and 150 kW in the past year. So most of your local schools, restaurants, and the like kind of fall into that small commercial category. For those customers, they are now going to be compensated for their on-bill credits. The net metering credits that they receive on their bill for being a subscriber used to be compensated at the value of energy and capacity from the utility if they were on the default rate. If they're with a retail energy supplier, the retailer established the value. But now moving forward, the utilities are going to compensate all of those small commercial and residential customers the same way. And it's going to be based on the utilities cost of energy, capacity, and transmission. So in ComEd territory, that means that the average net metering credit is going to go from, say, 5.5 cents to closer to 7 cents a kilowatt hour. In Ameren, probably closer from like 4.5 cents to maybe 4.75 cents, right? So it's an increase in the value of the net metering credits. It's a standardization across default rate customers versus retail supply customers for those residential and small commercial customers. So for that sector, this is really good valuation. For larger users, say a university, a large business that decides it wants to subscribe, their retail energy supplier, just like with the C&I customers, their retail energy supplier needs to compensate and provide net metering credits based on energy capacity and transmission. Again, that's going to be a complication, but it technically is a higher valuation for those net metering credits. So there's a more economic incentive to participate. And so I think that those are all net positive. Where I still think there need to be improvements, and maybe this is the bad news, is that the main constraint in community solar is customer acquisition. A customer has to sign up on their own. They have to register with the IPA. There's paperwork. There's a lot of different suppliers out there with a lot of different contract terms. It can be a little overwhelming for the smaller subscribers. So getting these subscribers has been traditionally challenging. My sense is that it would be a good step for the industry if they could reapproach the legislature and make a small change in the Illinois Power Agency Act that would allow municipalities that have municipal aggregation to treat community solar subscriptions the same way that they treat retail energy supply, and allow for the wholesale application of community solar subscriptions to their residents. In this case, you don't need 10,000 residents to each sign up separately. You can get all 10,000 of those residents signed up on a standardized product, and really be able to get economies of scale in the sign-up process. This is a lesson we learned 10 years ago with retail energy supply, was that municipal aggregation was the way to make that work. It's going to be the same issue here. So that's not part of this bill, but I think that that's probably the next step that's going to be necessary to make community solar a growing concern. We have about 150 megawatts of community solar in the state under development now. CEJA calls for about that amount to be deployed every year going forward. So you can build it, but you can't build it economically unless you've got those customers ready to go. So I think that that's the next issue that the industry has to address is, okay, how can we standardize and streamline and scale up this sign up process?
Yes. Well, this is fascinating. If you can spare a few more minutes, let's
Sure.
talk about medium scale utility and large scale utility. Historically, there's been very little large scale solar period in Illinois. We had a 20 megawatt facility in central Illinois, and that was built, I don't know, 10 years ago now. And that was about it, right? But with the advent of FEJA, then there was a program, a REC program, right? That and I call it a reverse auction. That's not technically correct. But anyway, the RECs it was a competitive REC market, and the low bidder was the early bird getting the worm was the low bidder. And some of these prices were crazy low, right? Like a penny or something like that, I think. But now we have a tranche of 100 to 250 megawatt projects, and then there's a tranche of 10 to 50 megawatt projects, which some of them are under construction. I was with a developer last night who has a project in Lincoln, Illinois. It's a 70 megawatt project, and it's well under construction. That's what I call medium. But what do you see in your crystal ball with CEJA and these 10 to 500 megawatt scale projects? Is this going to fuel the fire or in some way quench it?
I think it's going to be largely additive for a few reasons. One, the legislation calls on the IPA to immediately undertake competitive bidding for a substantial amount of new of RECs sourced from utility scale wind and solar. So they're going to be going to market very soon. So we expect that to be a boost. The other issue is a little bit more subtle. In the past, as you had indicated, the selection process was based on competitive bid, and the lowest priced REC offers were accepted first, and that led to a 15-year REC contract for the winning bidder, right? And the prices were low. You're right, $5, $6, $7, $8, $9 per REC for 15 years. Didn't look like enough, but some developers were able to make that kind of pencil out for themselves. Moving forward, the IPA is directed to utilize what are called index REC contracts. And an index REC contract is different than the fixed price REC contract that was utilized under FEJA. The developers under FEJA knew that they could receive their $5, $6, $7, $8 per REC from the utilities. And then to make everything work out, they needed to find a buyer for the energy and capacity. And that's where they really ran into some challenges, because there's not very many entities that are willing to sign 15, 20, 25-year deals for energy. The utilities don't. The utilities, ComEd and Ameren in Illinois, they only purchase 1, 2, and 3-year contracts for the IPA process. So the developers under FEJA had not only the challenge of bidding into the IPA's REC program, but then they also had to find somebody to buy the energy. So that was the old model. The new model is an index contract. And the index contract says, okay, developer, tell us what your strike price is. The strike price is the price that the developer needs to develop the project. And let's just use some numbers examples. Let's say a developer needs $50 a megawatt hour to build a project. That $50 a megawatt hour is going to be more or less guaranteed through a combination of market revenue and REC revenue. Okay, so instead of having to go out and find your buyer for your energy, what the index contract says is, okay, look, you said you needed 50, you were selected. Let's take a look at where the market is in year one. Let's say year one, the average locational marginal price where you were selling into was $30. Okay, so you said 50 was what you needed. You sold your energy into the market at 30. You sold it the LMP. You just dump it into the wholesale market. You don't need a counterparty. So 50, your strike price, minus 30, what you earned from the LMP, leaves 20. You're going to be paid $20 a megawatt hour for your REC for this quarter. Let's say the next quarter comes along. You still have a strike price of 50, but let's say the market price for power during that period was $45. Well, $50 your strike price minus $45 from the LMP leaves you $5 to be covered by the REC. You get paid $5 per REC for that quarter. So this structure is really designed to alleviate the need, in theory, for a firm buyer for that energy. You can sell into the market and have the REC price make up the difference between market and your strike price. It's going to be more complicated than that. But we'll see what the IPA comes out with in terms of their rules. I'm certain that the agency can figure this out. But it's an innovation that I think is going to be attractive to some developers when they understand that this mitigates some of their risk. And I think that once they can get comfortable with the mechanics, that they'll be very interested in participating in these auctions.
It certainly favors those developers who have a history in REC trading, like Sol Systems, for example. The other thing that developers will do is they will just sign up en masse PPAs with big off-takers like, the Facebooks and Googles and Microsofts of the world and say, to heck with the REC program. I'm going to sell these RECs to Microsoft. And then they don't need the state program. They can potentially circumvent the prevailing wage rules. And so there's some nuances here that the sophisticated developers, and they are very sophisticated. Unless they're startups, right? And it's a spectrum, good, bad, ugly, I like to say. And we're looking for good developers. If you're a good developer, please reach out to me. We are building 10 to 500 megawatt solar farms across the country. So if you're listening to this show, please reach out to me on Twitter, TG Montague, or on LinkedIn. I'm very easy to find. And tgmontague@gmail is also my Gmail address. So Mark, in our last moments here together, what else would you like to leave our listeners with about the next wave? And maybe we'll circle back in 6 months and do an update for our listeners, right? Because there is a lot of rules. Oh, we haven't talked about storage. We should probably talk about storage.
Sure.
And some of my colleagues are like, "Oh, Tim, we don't want to talk about this because this is kind of a secret. These storage incentives are very sweet." Well, it's right there in the language of the bill, and if you just Google the title of the bill, you'll find the text, and then you can search through the text for the word battery storage. And then you'll see that there is a $250 per kWh incentive for storage, which is eye-poppingly generous. It's one of the most generous, if not the most generous storage incentives in the country. The question, as we were talking in the pre-show, is what exactly is that going to apply to? For sure, residential, commercial, industrial. But will it apply to utility scale? I'm guessing not, just because that would just be too good to be true. Storage is so wonderful for the grid. You mentioned, there's not enough capacity on the grid in Illinois for all these solar and wind farms. Well, if we build a bunch of big battery farms, there is capacity, right? Because that battery is like a shock absorber, right? It's constantly doing this. Too much energy on the grid, it absorbs it. Too little energy on the grid, it releases it instantaneously, and it provides other grid services like frequency regulation, which the grid needs. It's truly a wonderful resource for the grid operator, right? It's a dream come true. It's just very expensive. And so we only see this happening in markets where energy is expensive, like California. And now in ERCOT, there's a huge wave of storage coming into ERCOT in Texas, of course, Hawaii. And if you don't know this, if you have a rooftop solar array on your facility, your home or your business, but you don't have a battery, you cannot use that solar when the grid goes down. So batteries are great for resiliency when the grid goes down or there's a brownout. if you have the hardware to island from the grid and have a microgrid, and then you can run emergency loads, keep the refrigeration and the lights on and the furnace running so you don't freeze your butt when the grid goes down, right? Like people did in Texas last February.
Right.
Crossing my fingers we don't get another one of those storms. But we humans are like ants, I like to say, right? The storm comes and washes our home away, so to speak, and then we just build right back. And we go, well, we're back. Well, we're not back. We need to upgrade our infrastructure so that we can weather the storm, so to speak. I mean, luckily, I've lived in Illinois since, this time around, I've lived in Illinois since 2004. And I don't have any recollection of a major grid outage since 2004 in Illinois. I did live in California before that, and we had rolling blackouts and brownouts, sometimes for good reasons and sometimes for nefarious reasons, and we don't have time to go into that. But what do you think about storage, Mark, and what should our listeners be thinking about?
Yeah, I think that the storage incentives, as you indicated, are quite generous. And I think that there's a couple of things at play here. My sense is that maybe there was a strategy that said we want battery storage deployment in Illinois. Deploying at the grid level, a little complicated. Who's going to own that? Isn't that kind of like power generation? Shouldn't the private sector take on all that risk? That type of conversation that happens on occasion in Illinois. So my sense is that maybe the battery storage here is a starter, right? Let's see how battery storage can work as a non-wires alternative at the distribution level. Let's see how deployment can work. Let's understand better how all this can come together, especially under the context of FERC Order 2222, which is going to allow smaller distributed generation assets, solar and batteries, to participate in wholesale market capacity markets. So my sense is that this is something of a starter. I imagine we'll probably see greater initiative. If deployment is successful at the distributed level, we'll probably see another iteration sometime in the future to support deployment of batteries at the utility scale level. I think also
build back better, right? Build back better, and 30% ITC and the standalone storage ITC in the works. Those are also potentially big moves that impact the storage industry.
Exactly right. And then, there's also the reality that these costs, all these incentives aren't free money. Just like the inverter rebate for solar, this, as I understand it, I haven't seen the tariff yet, but my understanding is that this is utility money and it's going to go into the rate base, and the utility is going to be compensated to recover not only their capital, but also a return on these assets. So, they're a big winner out of this as well. So, everybody has to, have a revenue stream on this. And I'm not saying anything is wrong with that, but it is something that I think was necessary to maybe bring the utilities along to understand that this was something that could be good for them, not only from a system standpoint, but also financially. So we'll see how it works out. As you'd indicated, the tariffs still need to be written. There's, working groups that have to address this, and transmission interconnection, and lots and lots of meetings. So this is the Consultant Full Employment Act, Lawyer Full Employment Act, all that type of stuff. Everyone's going to be very busy for the next 12 months, working through, how to regulate all these ideas and put them into practice.
Great. Well, I want to thank you, Mark Pruitt of the IPA. Mark was the director of the Illinois Power Agency, the first director, and now has a consultancy called what?
The Power Bureau.
The Power Bureau. So if you just Google the Power Bureau, you can find Mark Pruitt. He's also a professor at Northwestern University, and I look forward to circling back with you, Mark, in 6 months or so, if you could be so generous with your time, and we will update our listeners on what's going on in Illinois. In the meantime, check out all of our content at cleanpowerhour.com. That's where you can find all of our audio and links to our YouTube channel. Reach out to me on Twitter. Love to hear from my listeners. And most importantly, let's grow solar and storage. I'm Tim Montague. Have a great day, Mark.
Take care, Tim. Thanks a lot.